Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. Today we will try to talk philosophically with Ukrainian philosopher Vakhtang Kebuladze. Hello, Vakhtang.
Hello.
We are in Kiev. We are making this podcast hearing the aviation sirens, which are telling us that there can be an attack, but Kiev dwellers are already more or less accustomed to it. Ukraine World podcast. Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the biggest Ukrainian media NGOs. Before we start, don't forget to let me remind you that you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Today we will try to talk about Russia and Ukraine, about some philosophical, historical, political issues. So the whole world is asking the question, Vakhtang, what is wrong with Russia? What is wrong with Russia?
I would say everything is wrong with Russia. And the main issue, I would say, probably it's a paradox of modern world that Russia doesn't exist at all. Russia doesn't exist as political nation. Russia is a great empire, but it's not a political nation at all. And these events show it for us. There is no political nation in Russia. There is state, the power, and the population. We cannot say that Russia has its own citizens, and there are a civil society, the political nations, the idea of these political nations. That's why it's nothing. It's absent of life. It's death.
And it's interesting that despite all that, Russia is now invading Ukraine and show the extreme cruelty. So I cannot explain, well, basically we will try to explain this, but this shelling of residential areas, these missiles into the downtowns of the cities, of Russian-speaking cities like Kharkiv. We remember like a week ago there was this missiles attack on Kharkiv. And the shelling of maternity houses where pregnant women are giving birth to children, and that we know that some of them died recently in Mariupol. This extreme cruelty with regard to Mariupol, also a Russian-speaking city. And now reports are saying that over 2,000 people in Mariupol are dead. So how do you explain this extreme cruelty?
I absolutely agree with you that it's extreme cruelty, and I would say that it's new level and new kind of cruelty in the modern world. And basically, the roots of this cruelty in the new type of Nazism, the Russian Nazism. We can use this word. We can use this word. Russism, I'm sure that we should use it even in scientific discourse. And what is the difference between the traditional Nazism, so to speak, and this new Nazism? It's dehumanization of the subject of these nations. That means that, for example, the German Nazism in 20th century dehumanized the Jewish people, for example, but the German people was Übermenschen, Superman. For Russian Nazism, the Russian people are not people at all.
They do not have any value. Therefore, we are saying that they are sending their soldiers and do not really care of taking the bodies back.
Absolutely, it was cruelty against its own populations, against its own people, it's against its own soldiers. And it means that not only for the Russian state, the Russian people are not people, but for them, it's themselves, they are not people at all. They don't feel themselves like normal people.
So when some analysts are saying that, look, they're bombing civilians, because they try to provoke a basic outflow of citizens, like pragmatic approach that they tested in Syria, for example. Bomb cities as much as possible, bomb hospitals, bomb schools, to create a feeling of panic that nobody is protected. And even in such cities as Kiev, which is bombed, which is shelled, but not that heavily, we see that it creates this, a feeling of panic, and many people are leaving. But you're saying that it's not only this pragmatic attitude; it's also the kind of this dehumanizing approach even to its own citizens. We see the reports that in Belarus there are so many dead Russian soldiers in morgues, and nobody cares about them. Nobody makes the calculation, and they are being fired from the army before the, let's say, on the date pre-war dates. So what's happening? Why they do not care even about their own citizens?
Because it's real evil, yeah, and I would say that it's a great challenge for all our civilization, not only for Western civilization, not only for Europe, but for humankind at all. And probably it's also a challenge for Christianity, because we think that evil is some kind of absence of good, yeah. But now we see that evil can exist in this world, and it's not only Putin; it's Russia, Russian soldiers who killed us, who killed themselves, who leave their soldiers on the fields of Ukraine. It's a real evil, and it's very dangerous. It's really dangerous for all humankind, not only for Ukraine or for Europe.
How would you interpret what is going on right now if I tell you that Russians are showing the symptoms of a wounded empire? So we saw the symptoms before in the 20th century. We saw it in Italian fascism, in German Nazism, when these nations felt that there is some empire behind their backs. They lost it, and they tried to regain it with huge cruelty, with huge endeavor, with huge vertically integrated state. And Russia is trying to do the same. Therefore, the loss of Ukraine is so painful for it. So it tries to bring it back with extreme cruelty. But basically, it shows its weakness, because it cannot bring Ukraine back with soft means, with taking back the Ukrainian hearts and minds, although they have all the capacity to do that. They had it, at least in the past. Would you agree with this interpretation that this is kind of the last attempt of this wounded empire to bring its greatness back, and therefore it is doomed for failure?
Yeah, I would say yeah, because this expansion, this cruel expansion, is a signal and symptom of death of empire, and it was idea by Arnold Toynbee, the author of Study of History, that this expansion normally just looks like a power of empire, but really it's the end and the death of empire, first of all. On the one hand. On the other hand, it's a great difference between Russia and I would say the traditional empires, yeah, like Spain or Great Britain, because Russia has all colonies in the body of empire, and it's a great problem for Russia itself, where can stop the destruction of empire. I don't know. Yeah.
So if the empire has its colonies in the bodies with no clear-cut borders,
yeah,
you can ask a question. Okay, and that's what Russians are afraid of. because, well, Belarusians, Ukrainians have gone. They think they try to bring Belarusians back, but what about Tatarstan? What about
Yeah, of course.
what about Komi? What about Tuva? What about Chechnya?
Chechenian people, yeah. It's
Yeah.
now there are. We see that there are the soldiers of Russia, the cruel soldiers of Russia. But it's today. What will be tomorrow? We don't know.
Exactly, and therefore they are really afraid of this collapse, right? But do you really perceive this kind of war as the last attempt of the empire to regain itself?
I want hope. Yeah, it's the contra spem spero. Yeah, we should hope that it's the last attempt, but it's, I don't know. I can say, because it seemed to us, for example, in for 8 years that it was last attempt. Yeah, Crimea, our eastern regions. Yeah. And it was, now we see that it was only the first step of this invasion, yeah. And if we don't stop them here, where they go then after Ukraine, we don't know.
They clearly say that they're waging a war against NATO, not against Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I think NATO should be prepared. But when NATO countries are saying that they're afraid of the World War III, the key thing is that Russia should be stopped in Ukraine. And Ukrainians are making huge heroic resistance so that not to lead Russia further. But unfortunately, there are much information coming from Russia saying that, well, they really did not expect the Ukrainian resistance at this level. They really suffer from sanctions and Western sanctions, and they can suffer much more in the coming months. And they will try to raise the stakes. And raising the stakes for them is either like a huge disaster that they can provoke, like nuclear disaster. They are controlling the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, or they can strike one of the NATO countries. What do you think? Is it real?
I don't know, because as I said, it's a new level and it's a new kind of evil and cruelty. That's why we cannot predict the new steps of Russia. But we should stop them now. Yeah, it's only one possible decision for us, for all of us, not only for Ukrainian, but for the all people in Europe and in all over the world.
What would you say to those people in the world who cherish Russian culture, who are saying that, look, there is a great Russian literature, there is Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, there is great Russian ballet, there is great Russian music, great composers, I don't know what else. What would you say to them?
I would say that all Russia's culture, so to speak, culture is kind of poison. Yeah, it's also a weapon against people. And if we read, for example, Pushkin, we can say that his literature, his poems are very xenophobic against Ukrainian, against Caucasian people, And I would say that Pushkin is proto-Nazi, proto-fascism, His literature is not his poetry, as I say, it is very xenophobic. That's why I think that we cannot say that, okay, Putin is bad, it's evil, but we have a great Russian culture. No, Putin is not a product of the cosmic evil. Putin is the product of Russian history, of Russian culture, of Russian literature, of Russian world, of Russian style of life. And we should understand that the Russian literature, the Russian religious philosophy, the Russian Orthodox Church are also the part of this evil, of this
And it's
danger.
important. Well, it's important. Of course, there are different tracks in Russian culture. I think we should also talk about dissidents. We should talk about the Jewish writers. We should talk about those writers who are also put in prisons. There are different various elements, but indeed there are many elements that we should be very careful about. And when you talk about Pushkin, well, for Ukrainians, it's quite a big suspicious poet, because Ukrainians know his poem Poltava, which was an answer to George Gordon Byron poem about Mazeppa. But while Mazeppa in Byron is a good guy, good hero, Mazeppa is a Ukrainian hetman who challenged the Peter I in the early 18th century. Pushkin is portraying Ukrainians as bloody bandits, and basically perverse people, because Mazeppa is a traitor, but not only traitor to the Tsar, but also moral traitor, because he tries to seduce a very young beautiful lady. And we see this line actually, downgrading other nations, downgrading. So the colonial literature, you mentioned previously, I remember this Edward Said quote that culture is a field of struggle. So in this sense, what strikes me is how much people in the world globally studied Western colonialism, or what Said calls Orientalism. So this kind of exotization of the other just to marginalize him. How little it was done to study Russian colonialism.
But we have a very good book, by Eva Thompson, Rush Imperial Knowledge, Russian Literature and Imperialism, and she started with Pushkin, from Pushkin, Lermontov, from 19th century to the end of 20th century, and she analyzed the Russian literature, and she shows us that all these roots of hate are there in Russian literature and in Russian culture. So we can use this methodology by Edward Said, this idea that the culture is the field of struggle, also to the Russian culture, to the Russian literature.
But I think there is one important distinction, is that Orientalism is basically trying to show the other as very different, very other, very exotic, and therefore kind of a marginal, while Russians were trying to say in many aspects that, well, the cultures that they have been colonizing are basically the same as Russian culture. So it was not only colonization narrative, it was also assimilation narrative. It was also a struggle against identity. So your identity, it's not something, for example, racial identity that you will always keep with you, and therefore you will be always marginalized. It's like a message that you can renounce your identity, because you're Ukrainians, well, you're close to us, you speak the same language, so, well, as they think, that you should better renounce your language, your music, your culture, speak our language, and you will be ours. And therefore, I think this explains why, for example, in current Russian propaganda, we see many people from different cultures, people like Armenians, Georgians, they're right now they're leading their roles, or people
but they lose their roots, they lose their identities. They're Russians, and they speak Russian language, and the Russian language today is speech of hate, and they used to do it. So, and this idea that you can easily lost your identity and to choose another one, it's also a very dangerous idea. That means that we can easily lose all feature of human being. We can reduce our existence to biological level. and then probably receive new identity. But it is a great mistake, because if you reduce the human being just for the biological level, you lost the human being at all.
That's what Soviet Union was trying to say,
of course,
right? To construct these Soviet people, who basically Soviet people should have forgotten their past, their traditions, their religion. They should have adopt one common identity of proletariat history. All their national history should have been replaced with a single history of the party, of the Communist Party, and the history of the proletariat. But it didn't work, actually. It works. It works.
It works, and it's danger. So we know the Soviet past. We know the Soviet people. What that means, Soviet people. It's very dangerous.
What would you say to those people in the West who are saying that, look, we should reconcile the Ukrainians and Russians? There are in cultural spheres, there are lots of these initiatives. We would make an evening, a literature evening. We would invite a Russian, a Ukrainian, of course, a Russian who would be critical of Putin, and Ukrainian poet, Russian poet, so that they read their literature and show that behind all these atrocities of the Russian army in Ukraine, there is some deeper possibility of dialogue. What would you say to
I would say Putin is enemy of our present, and Russian liberals and these people who think that they can speak with Russian liberals and Russian artists and use the Russian culture for peaceful coexistence of the different nations, for example, Ukrainian and Russian nations. They are the enemies of our future. They are the enemies of our children, because Russia cannot exist. Russia can exist only like an empire, aggressive and very dangerous empire. That's why we should deconstruct the whole idea of this great Russia culture, and only in this way we can bring peace to the Ukrainian cities and to Europe and all over the world.
It's not, for me, it's not like deconstructing this great Russian culture, but we should approach the Russian culture as the whole world approaches critically to any other culture. As I said, why do we have tons of literature about Western colonialism in Western literature, but very little is still done with regard to Russian literature, Russian filmmaking? For example, right now we have all this series of Russian propaganda filmmaking. So I think the illusion that many in the West are having is that Russia is a nation state. And they do not understand that Russia is the last empire in Europe, and that this trend of collapsing empires started, for example, in the First World War, collapse of the Habsburg Empire, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, that then it was reborn, German Empire, that it was reborn. In the Second World War, these two empires clashed. Then German Empire finally collapsed, and thanks to this collapse of the empires, we have now European Union. Many of these countries of the European Union are actually former empires, not a nation state. So they also went through a very difficult process of turning into the nation states, then turning into the integration project. And Russia was myopically perceived as a nation state and not as an empire. And therefore the empire which is historically should go through the same basically process of decolonization, of de-imperialization. And therefore in the Russian propaganda you have so much disgust for this the very idea of the decolonization. Therefore they hated so much the Black Lives Matter movement, because they were showing to the West that, look, your de-imperialization, decolonization was the wrong path. Look at these colonized people, they are now going against you, and we will not make this mistake. I think that was also one of the reasons for their doing right now? What do you think?
Oh, many questions. The first of all, I would say the first of all, the Russia is not, as I say, political nation, yeah, and national state, and many people all over the world perceive Russia as national state, but it is wrong. It's a mistake. It's wrong, yeah. The second question: is it possible at all for Russia to be a national state, to create a real political nation? I am not sure that it's possible at all. Yeah? And it's a great danger, because if we have so many people near Europe, near our civilization, who cannot create a real political nation, we should ask ourselves, okay, what should be later on this territory? Yeah? And this my idea that Russia is not a civilization at all, it's a shadow civilization, it's a shadow of European and Western civilization. It repeats all form of our Western civilization, but like a shadow.
In a distorted way.
Yeah, of course, yeah. That's why the future of Russia, for me, is a future of darkness, yeah. And I'm afraid of that. I cannot predict what it will be, but I'm not sure that it's possible at all to create the real political nation with its political institutions, culture, and so on. Yeah.
Do you think that Ukrainian resistance right now puts the Russia in danger? Because we understand that this huge empire, if it tries to make a very quick, victorious war, and if it fails, that basically creates huge problems for it because it loses legitimacy. Do you think?
For empire, yeah. But it would be a great challenge for Russian people, and they should find the answer if they can create the real nation, yeah? Not empire, but the real political nations. It's a great challenge for Russian people, and it's good. I think that it's way to the new world. Yeah, to the new world, not only for us but for Russian people also.
So you believe that one day Russians will be a democratic nation, like at least like Ukrainians?
I don't know. I cannot predict it.
Because my problem with that is that Ukrainians do have a democratic tradition. We talk about it a lot. Ukrainians do have a culture with huge European political influences, with, for example, the autonomous cities, with autonomous communities, the so-called German law, Magdeburg law, with Western influences in education, Latin literature in Latin, influences of Catholicism, of Protestantism, etc. Whereas Russia is not really subject to these influences. So, by the way, it's interesting that many of them were going through Ukrainian territory, right? Okay.
But it's not our problem, I would say. Yeah, it's a problem of Russian people.
Yeah, it can be a problem of the whole world.
Yeah.
Okay, we will finish on that. We will try to analyze Russia a little bit. I hope in one of our next episodes, of course, we will talk about Ukraine and why Ukraine is so resistant. What are the roots of Ukrainian resistance? What is Ukrainian political culture? We talked with Vakhtang Kebuladze, a well-known Ukrainian philosopher and professor at Kyiv Taras Shevchenko National University. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor at UkraineWorld.org. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, to our podcasts on SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Stay with us.